flight line's no place for tourists, ma'am. Back it up. Come on, look at her. She's teeny tiny." The words carried across the concrete in the flat gray light before sunrise, and the 4 young Marines behind the corporal laughed the way young men laugh when one of them has decided to be funny. The corporal stood with his boots apart and his hands on his hips, a plain captain in clean coveralls, and he had planted himself between the small woman and the fighter she had been looking at, and he was pleased with the size of his own voice. The woman did not argue. She took 1 step back, exactly 1, and let her hands hang loose at her sides. She was not tall. She came up somewhere short of the corporal's shoulder, and in the plain blue flight jacket she wore, with nothing on the collar and no badge swinging from a chain, she looked like she might have wandered in from the parking lot and lost her way among the tail flashes and the ordnance carts. She had been told to move by louder men, in louder places, and she had learned the cost of the ones who could not be moved. So she moved, and she kept looking at the jet. The flight line ran long and straight under the paling sky, a row of FA-18 Hornets parked wingtip to wingtip with their canopies down and their intakes bagged. The squadron's tail flash repeated down the line like a signature written over and over by the same hand. Across the wide apron, a work detail was setting risers and a field of folding chairs, and a Marine on a ladder was fixing the group colors to a stand, because at 10:00 that morning, the squadron would change command, and the whole station knew it. Somewhere, a generator hummed. A tow tractor idled and went quiet. The salt came off the water 2 miles distant, under the jet fuel and the hot metal smell of a flight line waking up, and gulls stood along the seawall in a gray row and did not yet bother to fly. She had come out early on purpose. She had wanted the line before it filled, the jets before the crowd, the quiet before the ceremony that would put her name on all of it. So she had parked in the visitor's lot and walked in through the gate on an escort authority that the young Marine at the barrier had not looked at twice, and she had come out onto the apron in the last hour of the dark and stood among the aircraft the way a person stands in a church before the service, alone, unhurried, listening to a building she already loved. Then the plane captains had come out to their birds, and one of them had found her. Corporal Brett Maddox was 22 and had decided the morning belonged to him. He had a formation to shine for, and a squadron changing hands, and an audience of his own crew. And here was a small civilian standing too close to his aircraft, and she made an easy thing to be large about. So he was large about her. "Ma'am, hey, ma'am." He snapped his fingers, once, as if she were a dog that had wandered off a leash. "You lost? Family day's not till the fall. This is a working flight line. You can't be out here." "I know what it is," the woman said. "Then you know you can't be on it." He looked back at his squad and lifted his eyebrows, playing it, and they gave him what he wanted. "Look at her. Teeny tiny. Wind's gonna come off the water and carry her right out to sea." The woman did not argue. She took her 1 step back and let her hands hang, and she kept her eyes on the Hornet, and there was nothing lost in the looking at all. Master Sergeant Gus Redmond was 3 jets down with a flashlight in his teeth, running a panel check, and he saw the whole thing without turning his head. He was 49 and had been a maintenance chief for longer than the corporal had been alive, and he had learned to read a flight line the way other men read faces. What he read now, in the small woman in the blue jacket, made him take the flashlight out of his teeth. "Watch her eyes, Hatcher," he said quietly to the lance corporal beside him. "Tourists look at the paint. She's reading the jet." Lance Corporal Milo Hatcher, 20 and new, looked. The woman's gaze was not wandering. It moved along the Hornet in an order, from the radome to the pitot boom to the pylons under the wing, pausing where a trained eye pauses, at the seams, at the seals, at the small red flags that meant a thing was still safe, and there was nothing lost about it at all. It was the look of an owner, or the look of a person who had once trusted her life to a machine exactly like this one, and had never gotten out of the habit of checking it. The corporal turned back to his squad, satisfied, and the sun came up over the flight line and lit the canopy she had been told she could not approach, and the small woman stood in front of it, still as poured concrete, and waited for a morning she already knew the ending of. Maddox walked a slow circle around his aircraft, the way he had seen senior Marines do it, narrating for the benefit of the squad, and he did not lower his voice when he passed the woman. He touched the jet as he went, a proprietary pat on the intake lip, a slap on the tire, the gestures of a man performing ownership of a thing that belonged, in truth, to the United States, and to the pilot whose name was on the rail. She spoke to him then, evenly, without heat. "Your pitot still bagged," she said, "and you've a pin on the deck, Station 2. Maddox stopped. "Excuse me?" "The pitot cover. It's still on the boom. And there's an arming pin under the pylon, Station 2, on the deck where it fell. That's a foreign object hazard, and it's a launch hazard, and either one of them will ruin somebody's day. Probably yours." The squad went quiet the way a group goes quiet when someone says a thing that might be true. Maddox laughed to cover it, but the laugh came a half-beat late. "Ma'am, I have been on this line since before you found the front gate." But Redmond had already crossed the space between the jets, and he crouched under the wing, and he came up with a red-flagged pin pinched between his gloved fingers and held it up where the corporal could see it. Then he looked at the pitot boom, and the cover was on it. Bright red streamer and all, exactly where she had said. "She's right," Redmond said. There was nothing playful left in his face. "Pull that cover. Police your deck, Corporal. Station 2. And while you're down there, think about the fact that a civilian you called teeny tiny just caught 2 write-ups on your aircraft before you did." The woman had not moved to point at either one. She had simply known, the way a person knows the layout of a house they grew up in without needing to walk the rooms. And then, half to herself, watching the crew, she said the store configuration on the wing aloud, the fuel tank and the pylons, in the plain shorthand of someone reading a loadout. And after it, unbidden, the first 2 steps of the procedure for a hung round, the words coming out in the worn, exact order of something that had lived a long time in the muscle and not the mind. Redmond heard it, and his attention sharpened to a single point, because those were not words a person read in a manual once. They were words you said out loud in a cockpit with your heart going, so that your hands would do them right. There was more. She glanced along the row and, without being asked, told him the tire on the nose gear was a hair low and due, and that the intake cover on the next bird down had worked half loose in the night wind and would be on the deck within the hour if no one caught it. She did not say any of it to shame him. She said it the way a person reads a room they cannot help but read, the old scan running whether she willed it or not, the habit of a life spent making certain that a machine would not fail the people who flew in it. Redmond checked the tire. The tire was low. "How about that?" the chief said, mostly to himself, and looked at her a beat too long. Maddox recovered the only way he knew how, which was to make her small again. "Okay," he said, spreading his hands to his squad, working the grin back onto his face. "So the lady read a maintenance pub once. That's cute. That's real cute." He leaned on it. "She's probably here to inventory our staplers. Fleet sent us an auditor and forgot to put it on the schedule. Careful, boys. She'll ground the coffee mess for a safety violation." The squad laughed, because it was easier than the quiet had been, and the quiet had been getting hard to stand in. The woman said nothing. She looked at the canopy rail of the jet, at something on the metal below the sill. And then she looked away, and her face gave up nothing at all, and only Hatcher noticed that her jaw had set for a moment, and then gone smooth again, the way a person's does when they decide, on purpose, to let a thing go. Redmond drew Hatcher aside by the elbow. "Go find out who signed her onto the line," he said, low. "Somebody badged her through the gate. I want a name, and I want the authority." Hatcher went at a jog. He came back 4 minutes later with no easy answer, because the gate log had her checked in under an escort authority that traced up the chain and not down it, and stopped at an office a lance corporal did not have the rank to knock on, and the guard he had asked had gotten a strange, careful look and told him to leave it alone. Redmond took that in and looked again at the small woman standing in the sunrise, with her hands loose at her sides, watching his Marines work, saying nothing, and he began to watch her the way you watch weather coming in off the water, when the light goes flat and the birds go still, and you cannot yet say what is wrong, only that something is, and that it is already too close to outrun. By now the thing had a life of its own, the way these things do on a flight line with an hour to kill, and the squad had a nickname, and a nickname is how a joke puts down roots. "Teeny tiny," one of them said, tipping his chin at her, and another picked it up, and Maddox let them run with it because it played. They waved her toward the visitors' lot with big theatrical sweeps of the arm, ushering, bowing, holding an invisible door. They made a small comedy of her size and her silence, 4 young men in clean coveralls filling the last quiet hour before a formation with the cheap warmth of a shared joke at a stranger's expense, and the joke fed on the fact that she would not feed it. She did not rise. She stood with her weight even on both feet, and let it wash over her and past her, and the not rising only made them louder, because a joke that gets no reaction has to be told again, bigger, and then bigger, until it either dies or turns into something that is not a joke anymore. It turned. Maddox came close, closer than the joke needed, and put a flat hand on her shoulder, and moved her, physically, 1 step off the center line of the jet. It wasn't a strike. It was worse than a strike in a way, because it was casual. The shove you would give a piece of furniture that was standing where you wanted to walk, done for the laugh and not for the harm, which meant he did not even think of her enough to want to hurt her. She let herself be moved, a body that has been thrown across a cockpit by the shock of something going off close, a body that has been slammed into a harness at 7 times its own weight and gotten up and flown the next sortie, learns not to spend itself on a hand. She let the shove take her the step it wanted, and then she resettled her feet. Quietly, exactly where she had been standing, as if the concrete there belonged to her, and she had merely lent it to him for a moment, and was now taking it back. One Marine did not laugh. Lance Corporal Hatcher stood at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and he watched the small woman take the shove and set herself back, and something in it bothered him in a place he could not put a name to. He had a grandmother who had flown transports a long time ago and never spoke of it, who kept a shadow box in a hallway nobody used. And the way this woman held still under the corporal's hand reminded him exactly of the way his grandmother went quiet and far away when the young men at the family table explained the military to her over dinner. He had learned, too late, what his grandmother had done. He found himself hoping he was wrong about the feeling in his chest, and knowing he was not. "Corporal," Hatcher said, low. "Maybe ease up." Maddox waved him off without looking. "Relax, Hatch. She's fine, aren't you, ma'am?" "You're fine." Redmond had drifted back toward them without seeming to, the way a chief does when he wants to be close to a thing he has not decided about yet. He watched the woman take the nickname, and the sweeping arms, and the small cruelties of bored young men, and he watched her not spend a single ounce of herself on any of it, and the more she did not react, the more certain he became that he was looking at something the corporal could not afford to be wrong about. There is a stillness, that is fear holding its breath, and there is a stillness that is discipline, that has been earned in places where moving at the wrong moment gets people killed. And after 30 years, a man learns to tell them apart. This was the second kind. It was, Redmond thought, the stillest thing he had ever seen stand on a flight line, and the young men were laughing at it. "Hatcher," he said quietly, "stay close to your corporal. I think he's about to need a friend." The woman did not answer him. She looked at the jet. The sun was full up now. The risers across the apron were done. The chairs stood in straight, cold rows, and the group colors hung, waiting for the wind that would come with the heat of the day. There was maybe an hour left before the whole station stood in ranks on this concrete, and the small woman stood in the middle of it, unbothered, patient, the way a person is patient when they have already read the last page. If you have ever watched the young mistake a quiet person for a small one, stay with this, and subscribe to the Veteran Vault, because the next hour is going to teach a corporal something he will carry the rest of his life. The shove still hung in the air. The woman's feet had already resettled, precisely where she meant to stand, and she looked once more at the jet, at the rail beneath the canopy, and then out toward the far gate, where a staff car had just turned in off the main road and was coming down the flight line road at the unhurried speed of a car that is exactly on time and knows it. Maddox had stopped finding it funny and started finding it official. That was the dangerous turn, and he did not feel it happen, the way a man wading out does not feel the bottom drop until the water has him. "You got a line badge?" he said. "Because I'm not seeing a line badge. You can't be out here without a line badge, ma'am. That's not me making that up. That's the rules." He said the rules the way men say it when the rules have stopped being a thing they follow and become a place they hide. He made a show of it for the squad, patting the air a foot from her chest where a badge would hang, finding nothing, holding his empty hands up as if her lack of a badge were a personal insult to the Marine Corps and to him specifically. A few of the other Marines on the line had noticed by now that something was happening and had done what people mostly do, which was to find a reason to be looking somewhere else. A sergeant 2 jets down became very interested in a clipboard. A pair of lance corporals drifted toward the far wing and busied their hands. It is an easy thing to tell yourself, on a flight line at 7 in the morning, that a corporal moving a civilian along is not your business, and that if it is a little rough, well, she should not have been out here, and that the person who says something is the person who gets pulled into it. And so no one said anything, and the small woman stood alone in the middle of a growing circle of averted eyes, which she had also, in her life, seen before. "I'm calling security," he announced. "You do not touch these aircraft. I don't care whose auditor you are." "I wouldn't touch a jet that wasn't mine," the woman said. She said it quietly, and there was nothing in it that a man looking for a fight could grab, no anger to answer, no fear to push. And so Maddox did the thing men do when the words will not give them a handle. He took her by the arm. He meant to march her off the line. He got a grip above her elbow and pulled, and the pull did not land the way he expected, because her weight was not where a small, startled woman's weight should be. It was low, and it was ready, and for a half second, it did not move at all, the way a thing that is anchored to the ground does not move. An unhurried, total refusal that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with training. And then she allowed it to move, which was a different thing entirely. And Maddox felt the difference travel up his arm without his mind being able to say what it was. "Sir," she said, and the single word stopped him for half a second, because it was the wrong word for a startled civilian and the right word for something else, a word out of a world of ranks and reports, spoken by reflex to a man who had earned nothing from her. She did not repeat it. She let the wrongness of it hang there for him to notice, and he did not notice. She did not flinch. That was the thing Redmond saw from across the deck, the thing that turned his slow worry into a fast one and put him in motion. A civilian grabbed by a Marine on a flight line flinches. Everyone flinches. It is the oldest thing the body does. She did not. Her head turned, not to the hand on her arm, not to the corporal at all, but to the canopy rail of the jet she was being pulled away from, and her eyes fixed on the small block letters stenciled there under the sill. And for one long beat, she looked at that name, the way a person looks at the door of the house they grew up in, with something in the face that was almost tenderness and almost grief. No one else had read it yet. That was the strange, terrible fact of the morning. The name sat there in the risen sun where anyone could have read it, stenciled plain on the rail, and no one had, because no one had thought to connect the small woman in the blue jacket with the officer whose aircraft this was, and so the whole audience of the flight line went on not knowing what the letters said, laughing, filming, waiting for the small woman to be marched away, standing at the very edge of a thing they could not see. Redmond started across the deck at a fast walk that wanted to be a run. The worry had a specific shape now, and the shape was a bad one, and he was closing the distance when he saw, past the corporal's shoulder, the staff car roll to a stop at the edge of the apron, and the driver come around at the double to open the rear door, the way a driver moves for a senior officer and no one else, a hand on her arm, a name on the jet, a car at the gate. 3 things about to meet in the space of a single minute, and only 2 people on the whole flight line who could yet see that they were going to. Redmond reached them a stride ahead of the trouble and put himself squarely into it, between the corporal and the rest of the corporal's life. He had seen it before, in 30 years, on flight lines, from coast to coast, and 2 oceans between them. He had seen young men who mistook a quiet person for a weak one, and he had seen what it cost them when the quiet turned out to be the discipline of someone who had already been to the far edge of things and come back. He had a bad feeling he knew exactly which kind of quiet this was, and he moved to get his corporal clear of it before the boy stepped off a ledge he could not see. "Corporal." His voice was low, and it carried the way a chief's voice carries, under the noise instead of over it. "Let go of her arm, now." Maddox, still riding the momentum of his own morning, half-turned with the grin already forming. Sure, this was the part where the chief got in on the bit. "Master Sergeant, I'm just moving an unbadged civ off the—" "You have no idea," Redmond said, "who that is." Something in the flatness of it reached even Maddox, some cold thing under the words, and his grip loosened without his deciding it should. He did not let go all the way. He was 22, and letting go in front of the squad was its own kind of dying, and so he held on, lighter now, a boy holding the tail of a thing he had started and could no longer stop, and he looked from the chief to the small woman and back, waiting to be told this was a joke he could still climb inside of. Redmond was not looking at him. Redmond was looking at the woman's hands, at the way the fingers lay still and easy, hands that had done fine work under pressure and had nothing left to prove to anyone, and then at the canopy rail, and then he sent Hatcher at a dead run. "The arrival roster, and the program for the 1000. Move, son, move!" The chief looked at the small woman then, straight on, level, one professional asking another, the only question that was left. "Ma'am, who are you?" She gave him one thing, and only one, and it was not a boast, because it did not need to be. Boasts are for people who are not sure they will be believed. "I'm here for the 1000 formation," she said. It lay on the deck between them, a plain fact, and Redmond looked from the woman to the risers across the apron, to the field of empty chairs, to the group colors waiting on their stand, to the single word that sat at the top of the program in Hatcher's hand, and he did the arithmetic that a corporal had been too loud to do all morning. The formation at 1000 was a change of command. A change of command meant an officer arriving to take a squadron. The officer arriving to take this squadron had a name, and the name was on a program, and the name was also, he realized, his eyes going to it a final time. Stenciled on the rail of the jet, the small woman had been standing in front of since before the sun came up, the jet she had inspected like an owner. The jet a corporal had shoved her away from, for the crime of loving it more quietly than he did. Redmond turned it over and understood the whole size of it at once, and the color began to leave his own weathered face, which a corporal paying attention might have found instructive if the corporal had been able to pay attention to anything but the sound of his own mourning coming apart. "Ma'am," Redmond said, and his voice had changed, gone careful and formal. "I'm going to ask you to stand right there for 1 minute, and I am going to make this right." "I know you are, Master Sergeant," she said. "You already have." What the young man in the pressed coveralls did not know is what the next 10 minutes were going to teach him. Subscribe so you do not miss it, because a corporal is about to learn that the smallest person on the flight line was the only warrior on it. Hatcher came back at a sprint with a laminated program in his fist. Redmond took it and did not need to read past the top line. He looked once more at the canopy rail, at the block letters standing bright in the sun, and his mouth set in a hard, quiet line. And across the apron, the doors of the staff car opened, and a man with the silver eagles of a full colonel on his collar stepped out into the light and began to walk toward the hangar with the sergeant major a half step behind him. 14 years earlier, and 8,000 miles to the east, a valley in Afghanistan was trying to kill a Marine patrol, and Captain Adrian Calloway was 27 years old and coming down out of the sky to stop it. She heard it before she saw it, the way she always did, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller's voice climbing tight and fast in her headset from the valley floor, giving her the ridge, the friendly line, the distance between the two of them shrinking with every word he said. The patrol was pinned in a wadi with fire coming down on it from a ridge to the north, and the enemy was close to the Marines. Danger close. Close enough that the numbers the controller read up to her were the kind that made a pilot's mouth go dry, because the margin between the bomb that saved them and the bomb that killed them was measured in meters, and the meters were in her hands, on the stick, in the small corrections of a woman who had not slept enough and could not afford to be tired. Gauntlet. Be advised. Danger close. I say again, danger close. Friendly 0-200 meters south of the target. They are in the open. They are taking casualties. We need it now. She had fuel for a few passes, and daylight for fewer, and she brought the Hornet down lower than Doctrine liked, because Doctrine had not been written in that wadi and the men in it did not have time for Doctrine. She rolled in with the valley wheeling up green and brown to fill the canopy, and she walked her ordnance along the ridgeline so close to the friendly position that the controller's voice broke on the readback, and the first pass took the pressure off the left flank, and she felt it as much as heard it, the fire thinning under her. "Good hits! Good hits!" the controller called, and there was breath in his voice, now that hadn't been there a minute before, the sound of a man who had thought he was going to die and had just been handed a reason to think otherwise. "Gauntlet, they're still on the ridge. North end. We need one more. Danger close. Danger close. You are cleared." "Cleared in from the south," she said, flat and calm, because calm was the only thing she had left to give them, and calm was a great deal. She came around, the G's pressing her down into the seat, the world going heavy and gray at the edges, and then clearing, and she did it again. Tighter. Closer. Threading it between the Marines and the men trying to kill them, laying the ordnance along the crest of the ridge with a precision that had cost her 10,000 hours to be able to spend, in 3 seconds. And the fire on the patrol staggered and thinned, and for one bright second, she let herself believe she had them all. She did not have them all. In the seconds between the second pass and the third, in the blind moment while she was pulling off target and coming back around, A position on the patrol's flank was overrun, and a name went quiet on the net. Sergeant Rafe Conlon, 24 years old, who had been calling steady corrections up to her a minute before, in a voice as flat and sure as a man reading a checklist, stopped answering, and the controller's voice cracked when he said it, and Calloway flew the last pass anyway, for the ones who were still alive to save, and then she turned for home with her fuel state blinking amber and her hands very still on the controls, and something closing in her chest that would not open again for a long time. They gave her the Distinguished Flying Cross for that valley, for coming down closer than she should have, again and again, so that most of a patrol could walk out of a place that had meant to keep them. She never learned to want the medal. The ground unit she had covered gave her the other thing, the thing that stuck, the call sign that followed her onto every net she ever flew after, because the survivors had said, in the debrief and in the years since, that she had come down into that fire like a fist coming down, and after that day, she was Gauntlet. And it was not a name she had chosen, and not a name she would ever put down. What she carried was not the medal, and not the call sign. What she carried was the quiet arithmetic of the one she had not reached, the stone in the pocket she took out and turned over on bad nights, the 2 or 3 seconds that had belonged to Rafe Conlon and had run out while she was inverted and pulling and doing everything right. It was why she had stayed in when it would have been easier and kinder to herself to leave. It was why she had asked for this squadron, this command, these young Marines. It was why, decades later, she could stand on a flight line in a plain blue jacket and be called teeny tiny by a boy who had never once been shot at, and let it pass over her like weather, because she had decided in that cockpit, at 27, that she would never again fail to be exactly where the young Marines needed her to be. She was standing now in front of a jet with her name on the rail, deciding it one more time. The colonel was still 30 meters off and closing, and Maddox, who could feel the ground shifting under his boots without being able to name a single reason why, did the worst possible thing a drowning man can do, which was to reach for the surface by pushing someone else under. He needed to be right, in front of the chief and the squad, more than he had ever needed anything in his short and untested life, and so he tightened his grip on the small woman's arm and hauled her a full step toward the shadowed edge of the hangar, toward the place where a security escort would take her off his hands and off his conscience, and he narrated it loud so the whole deck would hear that he had been in charge of this the entire time. Come on. We're done. You can explain the badge thing to the guard. That's not my department. Take your hand off me, Corporal. The woman's voice had not risen. It had gone somewhere else instead. Lower and very level. The voice of a person offering a last piece of information as a courtesy. The way you would tell a man his brakes were about to fail. You are about to want to have. For one beat, the stillness in her was not a victim stillness at all. It sat behind her eyes with its own weight, patient and unimpressed and entirely without fear. The calm of a person who has been in far worse valleys than a corporal could dream of and had flown home from all of them, and the nearest Marines felt it before any of them could have said what it was. A cold draft off a person who was not what they had spent the morning deciding she was. The laughter that had carried them since first light faltered and thinned and died in their throats one by one, and the squad went quiet, and the quiet this time did not break. Hatcher had already stepped forward without deciding to. Corporal, let her go. Man, let her go. The other 3 had stopped laughing entirely now. One of them had lowered the phone he had been holding up. Another had taken a half step back, the way people step back from a thing they have realized is not safe to be near, and the small comedy of the morning was over, and every one of them could feel that it had cost more than they yet understood. The woman had still not looked at any of them. She had looked at the jet, and then at the letters on the rail, and then, once, level and unhurried, at the corporal's hand, where it held her arm, and there was a message in that look for anyone with the sense to read it, which the corporal did not have. Redmond took one more step. "Son," he said, and there was something almost gentle in it now, the gentleness a man uses on someone standing on a ledge. "I am telling you as a friend, take your hand off that woman." Across the apron, a voice called the formation. "Fall in." Boots began to move. The squadron poured out of the hangar and the ready rooms and the maintenance spaces and started to form up in ranks on the painted line, sergeants dressing the files, and the band shifted its feet, and the group colors lifted at last on the first warm breath of wind off the water. The morning had walked all the way up to the thing it had been walking toward since before the sun, and now it stood on the doorstep of it. Maddox felt the change in the air and mistook its meaning. He thought the quiet was the crowd finally taking his side, the squadron falling in behind their plane captain, and it steadied him. And steadied was the last thing he should have been. He gave the small woman's arm a last tug toward the shadow. "Let's go. Now." She turned her head then and looked at him, fully, for the first time all morning. And her eyes were not angry, and they were not afraid. And that was somehow worse than either would have been. They were patient. They were the eyes of a person who has decided not to hurt you, and is waiting, without much interest, for you to find out why you should be grateful for that decision. Whatever Maddox saw in them made him let go of the tug he had been about to give, though he did not release her arm, and he opened his mouth and found he did not have anything to put in it. The man from the staff car came on, and the silver eagles on his collar caught the risen sun, a full colonel walking fast and straight toward the small woman a corporal still had by the arm, and a half step behind him came a sergeant major built like a hangar door, and the whole shape of the next minute stood up all at once and became visible to everyone on the deck who had eyes to see it. Everyone except Maddox, who still had her arm, and who was still, God help him, talking. It was Redmond who ended it, because he could not stand to watch it run 1 second longer than it had to. He stepped in close, took the laminated program, and held it up beside the canopy rail so that the letters stenciled on the metal and the letters printed on the paper stood side by side in the light, where the corporal could not look away from either one. "Corporal Maddox," the chief said. "Read the rail." Maddox's eyes went at last to the block letters stenciled under the canopy sill, the letters the small woman had looked at 3 separate times that morning, the letters that had been sitting there in plain sun the whole time, while a squad of Marines laughed at the person they belonged to, Lt. Col. A. Calloway, Gauntlet, and then to the program in the chief's hand, to the line at the very top, under the printed words, Assumption of Command, where the same name stood again. The colonel arrived. He took in the grip on the woman's arm in a single sweep of the eyes, and his face closed like a hatch, dogging down. "Corporal," Colonel Nathan Prescott said quietly, and the quiet of it was the most frightening thing on the flight line that morning, worse than any shout could have been. "Take your hand off your commanding officer." Maddox let go. His hand opened on its own and came away from her arm as though the arm had turned to a hot stove, and he stepped back, 1 step, 2, and his face began to do the thing that faces do when the whole floor of the world drops out from under a man at once. First the confusion, the not yet, the surely not, the search for the joke, then the disbelief, the frantic rereading of her plain blue jacket for anything, a rank, a badge, a lie, that would let this not be true, and finding nothing on it, which was itself the proof, because the woman who did not need to wear the rank was the woman who most surely held it. Then the recognition, the name landing all the way down through him and hitting bottom, the name of a distinguished flying cross pilot, Gauntlet, a name he would have painted on his own body if he loved these aircraft even half as much as he had spent the morning claiming to love them. And then the horror, plain and total, and without any floor beneath it, as he understood, that every eye that had laughed with him all morning was now fixed on him, watching him go down. "Squadron," the sergeant major said, and Ike Dubois' voice went out over the whole formation like a struck bell. "Attention!" The line snapped to attention as one body, hundreds of boots coming together the length of the apron in a single crack of sound. Colonel Prescott turned square to face the small woman in the blue jacket and brought his hand up in a salute, crisp and full and unhurried, and the formation held itself rigid behind him, rank on rank of Marines, standing at attention for the officer a corporal had shoved and dragged and called teeny tiny not 1 hour before on her own flight line. Down the formation, Master Sergeant Redmond had come to attention with the rest, and there was something on the old chief's face that was not quite a smile, the grim satisfaction of a man who had read the weather right and taken no pleasure in the storm, and only in having called it. Beside him, Lance Corporal Hatcher stood rigid and blinking, and understood all at once why his grandmother went quiet at the family table, and swore to himself, privately, that he would drive out to see her that weekend, and ask her, finally, to tell him. Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Calloway returned the colonel's salute, exactly without flourish. Then she reached inside the plain blue jacket, and she took out the cover with the silver oak leaf on the front of it, and she set it on her head, and the small lost woman was simply gone, and the commanding officer of the squadron stood in her place, and she had not grown a single inch, and she had never needed to. Prescott turned to the ranks and pitched his voice to carry to the back of the formation. "Marines, your new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Calloway, the Distinguished Flying Cross. She has flown for Marines on the worst day of their lives, danger close, closer to the friendly line than any regulation would ever ask of her, so that men pinned in a valley could go home to their mothers." He let it sit in the silence a moment. "This morning she came out early to stand among your aircraft, and she was called a tourist. She was called teeny tiny. And she said almost nothing, because she did not need to, because a Marine does not measure a warrior with his eyes. She stood in the full risen sun with the whole squadron at attention around her, and the light bright and clean on her name on the jet, and she did not look at the corporal at all, and that was the worst of it for him, that she did not think of him even now enough to look. The reckoning came for Corporal Maddox not in front of the formation, which he might almost have survived, but afterward, in the shadow at the edge of the hangar, from Sergeant Major Ike Dubois, and it was quiet, and quiet was worse than any parade ground bellow could have been. There was no shouting. There was a low, exact, unhurried accounting of what the corporal had done, and to whom, and of the difference between the Marine he had shown himself to be that morning, when he thought no one who mattered was watching, and the Marine he had sworn he was. Dubois did not raise his voice once. He did not have to. He laid it out flat and let the corporal stand in it. He talked about the 50 men and women who had stood at attention for the woman the corporal had dragged. He talked about what the enlisted ranks owed an officer, and what one human being owed another, and how the second one was the one the corporal had failed first. Maddox was removed from the flight line pending review. He stood at attention through all of it, and did not trust himself to speak, and when it was over, he had the gray, hollowed-out look of a young man who has finally met the full size of his own mistake, and understood that he could not put it down. They brought the paperwork to Calloway in the squadron office an hour after the formation broke, the recommendation already leaning hard toward the end of the corporal's career, a page and a half of it, and she read it through with the cover set on the desk in front of her, and the silver oak leaf catching the light from the window. "No," she said. The sergeant major waited. He was a patient man, and he had learned that new commanders often said things they had not finished thinking. "He loves those jets," Calloway said. "You saw it same as I did, Sergeant Major. Everything wrong that boy did this morning came out of a kid who got up before the sun to go stand next to the finest machine he has ever been allowed near, and got territorial about it, and stupid about it, and cruel about it, because he is 22, and no one has ever made him pay for being any of those things yet. She closed the folder and set her hand flat on it. He's right about the jet. It is the only thing he got right today, and it is not nothing. Honor the ones who carry it quietly. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this story of a small woman and a loud mourning find the people who need it. I have buried Marines, Calloway said more quietly, who never got the chance to grow out of being 22 and stupid. I know their names. I am not going to spend one who still has the chance to become something, just because spending him would be easy and would feel like justice for about a day. She slid the folder back across the desk. Review it. Don't end it. He answers to me now. 3 days later, Corporal Maddox reported to her office, at attention, expecting the axe he had earned. She did not give him the axe. She gave him something harder to carry, which was a standard higher than the one he had been failing to meet, and a task, and a road back. And she told him plainly that she would be watching every step of it, and that the day he made plane captain on her aircraft for real, on merit, he would finally understand what he had come within an hour of throwing into the sea. He said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that had had every ounce of the swagger burned clean out of it, and he meant it all the way down, and he turned and went back to the line to begin the long work of deserving to be there. That evening, at last light, Lieutenant Colonel Calloway walked out alone to the jet on the end of the line, the one with her name on the rail. The flight line was quiet now. The risers struck, the chairs stacked and hauled away, the gulls back along the seawall in their gray row. She stood a while and looked at the Hornet in the failing light, and then she set her hand flat on the cool metal of the canopy rail, on the smooth paint beside the block letters, and she said a name that was not her own. "Rafe Conlon," she said, to the jet and the darkening sky. Still here. Still flying. She would call his mother that week, the way she called Louise Conlon every year, and she would tell her that a whole squadron of Marines had come to attention on a flight line that morning in the bright sun, and that some of it, all of it, if she was honest, was for a sergeant in a valley who had called steady corrections up to her in a flat, sure voice until the moment he could not call any more. The valor had never needed to shout. It had only ever needed someone willing to carry it, quietly, without being seen, the whole long way home. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more, for